Lovely to see you here for our day 4. My name is Maeve O'Rourke. I'm a lecturer at the Irish Centre for Human Rights, which is part of the School of Law, a sister aspect to the Centre for Disability Law and Policy. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be chairing this morning's session on young disabled people's involvement in movements and campaigns. And we have 3 wonderful speakers lined up. First, we are going to hear from Miro Griffiths, who is a research fellow in disability studies in the School of Sociology and Social Policy at the University of Leeds. Then we will hear from Ralu Bachu. Ralu is co-chair at the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans, Queer and Intersex Youth and Student Organisation known as IGLIO. But we'll hear far more about that from Ralu. And we will then hear via an online presentation from Martine Eliasson. And Martine works as a political advisor in Uloba, Independent Living Norway. And far more information, of course, is available about the speakers in your programme. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Miro to begin with your presentation. You know the drill about the timekeeping, 20-minute presentations from our speakers, so that we will have lots of time for questions and answers, which I'll be glad to chair at the end. So thank you, Miro.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? I think, yeah. So welcome, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. Yes, my name is Ms. Miro Griffiths. I'm based at the University of Leeds within the Centre for Disability Studies. And I come at this presentation from 3 angles, really. One, as a scholar and somebody who researches on disability issues and thinking about the social position of disabled people in society. I come at this as somebody who spent a lot of time advising various different disabled people's organizations and working with disabled people's organizations to have a rightful claim to political injustice and trying to reimagine accessible and inclusive societies. And I also come at this as a personal activist and somebody who spent many years within disability activism and participating in social movements in the UK and across Europe as well. The purpose of my talk really is just to give some oversight of research that I'm currently doing. And this is an exploration of disability youth activism across Europe. And this has 4 parts to the project, which is currently ongoing. We'll finish next year. We did I say we, but it was me. I did a survey of 250 young disabled activists, gaining insight into their views and experiences of disability youth activism. Conducted 25 semi-structured interviews, gaining more insight into the barriers and opportunities to take part in activism and social movements. I also ran several what we call arts-based workshops, which allowed young disabled people to propose ideas, demands, priorities for what constitutes an accessible and inclusive society. Because one thing that I think is quite frustrating is we use these terms so often: accessibility, inclusion. What do we mean by justice in regard to disability? Very rarely do we actually define what these terms mean. What are the demands associated with this? Where are the parameters of what constitutes inclusion as opposed to, say, integration? So I collected ideas about what people imagine for accessible and inclusive societies, and there's also going to be a documentary film capturing some of this. So in terms of this talk, what I want to do is just kind of give you some highlights from the research, things that will hopefully be of interest. I won't give it justice in 20 minutes, but what I will do is be very open to having conversations with people afterwards, and you can find my details in the program, and I'm more than happy for people to come and talk to me afterwards. So what I'd like us to think about is 4 particular areas. One is the context. So what is the current situation for young disabled people to engage in activism and social movements? I want us to think about the desires. What do young disabled people desire from engaging in activism? What are the reasons for doing so? Then I would like us to think about the tensions. Where are the kind of insights into the things that are frustrating, or indeed frustrating activists, young disabled activists in their participation. And finally, some practical issues, things that young disabled people are really focusing on in their quest for political subjectivity and engaging in politics. So in terms of thinking about context, it's important that we understand the literature around disability youth activism. And what we find is that the effectiveness and the sustainability of social movements, so how significant they are in progressing claims, but also how they can sustain and not be dismantled or not collapse very easily. And we have seen examples of collapses of disability activism across the globe. It's determined by the inclusion and participation of particularly newcomers and younger generations who come through in terms of taking part. But throughout the literature, we can see that there is considerable concern about how we recruit and ensure that young disabled people and children and marginalized communities within the disabled people's community, so when we think about the intersections with, say, sexuality or ethnicity, people who are coming from those experiences and want to articulate those experiences within their activism, there is considerable problems in the recruitment and also the participation and the influence. Because it's one thing to be part of something, it's another thing to actually influence its direction and its travel. So there's a question and concern around the recruitment and the participation. And the contemporary literature also highlights that there's a clear concern between how young disabled people engage in articulating a view and a presence and a purpose and a perspective on disability activism, and how that can often be constrained or trapped within what we call dominant conceptualizations of youth. So what I mean by that is, often when we talk about young disabled people's participation in activism and social movements, often their contribution is narrowed down to this framing of, well, this is just a youth perspective. And therefore, the young person's voice is only worthwhile and has value when we're discussing a youth topic. And this highlights really deep concerns, because in the way in which we conceptualize youth is often through a lens of being, having limited exposure to experiences, having a view that needs to be validated by those who have established or longer time in a particular space. So there is these concerns about how young disabled people and children are often trapped into only having credibility when their voice is required to talk about only youth issues. And when I spoke to young disabled people in the research, so often they talked about the importance and the desire to not just inform youth agendas, but to go beyond that and talk about the importance of contributing their voice to the broader claims and quest for liberation and emancipation. So my first kind of provocative statement, and I'll make a series of provocative statements through this presentation. My first provocative statement is, young disabled activists and children are being undermined by the existing organization and mobilization of disability activism. So the current way in which we organize disability activism does not allow for the involvement, the participation, and the value of children and young people within disability activism. And this will be to our detriment. So I've given some context. Now I'd like us to think a little bit about the desires and the desires for what young disabled people want. And as we explored the research, we identified several areas where young disabled people focus their attention on why they want to participate in disability activism. Firstly, there was this issue of the radical versus the incremental. So we start to understand that when young disabled people are wanting to engage in activism, for some, this is about the radical pursuit for overhauling the way in which we organize the social world. So we're thinking about politics, we're thinking about economics, we're thinking about issues to do with culture and social organization. For some activists, the necessity is you have to radically change this. You have to completely dismantle existing political and economics arrangements in order to progress towards accessible and inclusive societies. For other activists, for young disabled activists, there was a desire not to engage with the radical, but to engage with the incremental. So the idea of progressing change through existing arrangements, thinking about the policy and the legislative agendas that are already existing and how we may tweak this, how we may improve this over a period of time. And again, this raises issues around over-reliance on existing structures and arrangements. It raises issues around the significance of time. Time is not very well explored within activism in terms of the pressures and the consequences of allowing things to take a considerable amount of time in order to progress. So there's an issue around radical versus incremental. There's also an issue around the political and the economic overhaul, as I've spoken about, the desire to change the existing arrangements of politics and economics, compared to those who say, well, actually, we can work within the existing arrangements. Those who want to, and you can see this particularly in examples where maybe we think about the topic of productivity. For some young disabled activists, the idea of activism is to legitimize the status of the disabled person, to say, no, I can be a productive member of society. But for others, activists, young disabled activists, they want to question the whole notion of productivity, to say that actually you cannot be building accessible, inclusive societies on existing systems where productivity is valued in certain ways across others. There's also a question around the issue of pride and politicized identity. So many activists who I spoke to talked about the importance of the exploration of activism was around building not just a sense of a politicized identity, because so often across the globe, disability is not considered a political issue, and is trapped within the pathologized, the paternalistic, and the tragedy narratives associated with impairment. But the idea of actually recognizing that disability is a political issue and needs a recognized political status in trying to create change. But there's also a recognition of pride as well, how to build pride within an acceptance and value. And this raises a really interesting question about what aspects of pride are we exploring. Again, we can see concerns, perhaps for some activists, who talk about this idea of embracing notions of being positive about disability. Where, of course, many others will say, well, actually, the whole issue that we're trying to tackle in terms of exclusion is disabling environments. And actually, the pride is about recognizing the variance within human existence. And finally, there is the issue of building alliances as well. The importance of building relationships between different activists and social movements. So my second provocative statement today is, again, rooted in the research, is that the purpose of disability activism often traps itself within focusing specifically on disability. And I think this is a problem for disability activism, because instead, disability activism should be about orientating ideas, demands, and activities on realizing accessible and inclusive societies for all communities. How do we build and progress towards societies where all are welcome? But we can use disability activism as a way to highlight injustices not just for disabled people, but for all communities, and articulate an alternative for that. I've talked about context, I've talked about desires, now I'd like to talk about tensions. So within disability activism, for young people, there is some levels of tensions between established members and established organizations and newcomers and young people who are coming with their ideas and perspectives. And the first problem is much of disability activism is trapped within this idea of the truth. It has a perspective that what we are articulating or demanding is true, and everything else is seen as a danger and as a threat to that truth, and therefore it cannot be altered. So the problem then is when you have newcomers or new members coming into activism, people who are exploring their pride and identity, starting to grapple with ideas of political subjectivity. They want to articulate new ideas, creative, experimental thoughts about inclusion, accessibility, and justice. But it's coming up against this notion that, no, there is only one truth within activism. This is the way we will progress. So there's a concern about truth. There's also a concern about nostalgia. Because when I spoke to many established activists, they would often talk about the older days, the days when we would do this type of activism, or we would do these types of activities, and this was much better for progressing. So therefore, the new waves of activity, the new demands and new priorities, they were seen as not as successful, or they were seen as problematic compared to the nostalgic forms. So there's a concern about how we may romanticize previous experiences within activism. So for me, there's a question about how do we build new ideas, and how do we recognize that the purpose of newcomers and the purpose of children and young people's participation in activism is to welcome new forms of experimentation, new creative pursuits within this notion of recognizing on one hand the exploitation of disabled communities, and on the other hand thinking about, well, what is the alternative that we're trying to argue for? And this, I would like to just highlight an emerging tension which I'm seeing as well in the research between activists, young disabled activists. And this was around the notion of normality. So the concern is that for many activists I spoke to, when I said to them, what does normal, how do we situate normal within activism? Many activists would say, well, the purpose of my activism is to try to get recognition that I am a normal human being. I am ordinary. I want to be just like everybody else. But then, of course, this came up against the tension of other activists, young activists, who said, no, the problem is that normality is toxic, and normality has bred this idea that there's only a correct way to be and exist within society. Again, linking into notions of ableism, if people are familiar with this. So you can see a tension between those who want to disrupt normality and those who want to embrace normality as part of their activism. So my provocative statement here is about the significance of how do we imagine creative, experimental spaces within disability activism to allow young disabled people's ideas, to allow children, disabled children's ideas to flourish and be used at a point where we can then start to organize and orientate activities and ways of participating within political activism. So my final area, we've talked about context, we've talked about desires, we've talked about the tensions, and now I'd just like to highlight some practical focuses as well. When I spoke to young disabled people, and again, I'm happy to talk about this afterwards because this is going to be a snapshot, but when I spoke to young disabled people through the interviews and through surveys, there were some really interesting key topics that came up. One was the frustration with young disabled people who told me they want spaces to learn about activism, to learn about disability activism, and that this didn't exist. One, in terms of a space to learn about the history of activism, to understand what were the topics, what were the activities, where were the alliances that were being built, where were the problems, because again, activism is messy, and we have examples where activism has failed, or it's gone down a problematic narrative or route. So we need the spaces to learn about the history and the significance of the topics within activism. And many young disabled activists told me there is very limited spaces to understand the history. This raises fascinating questions, I think, about the way in which we archive knowledge and experiences within activism. There was also, when I spoke to them about understanding of disability activism, where do you go to understand activism? The most prominent space was social media. The second most prominent space was disabled people's organizations at the national, then the local, then the international, interestingly. So again, there's a question here about how we organize opportunities within our localities and within our spaces to connect the local to the national to the international. And thirdly, there was existing peers. So the significance of relying upon existing social networks to gain insight into understandings of disability activism. When I asked about interesting activities, so what are you most interested in doing when you're an activist? They would talk to me about promoting personal narratives of political injustice. So they wanted spaces to talk about their personal stories, but articulate that through the lens of political injustice. And again, this could be through online forms such as vlogging, and it could be blogging, and it could be engaging in debates and spaces online, and utilizing online forms of activism. There was also a question around, a focus on influencing existing policy and political structures. So many of them spoke about the desire to have representation. And again, to the question what we mean by representation, but here this was talking about having authority and influence within existing legislative, political, and policy-making processes to inform policy. Things around inclusive education, self-directed support, the importance of accessible housing and community presence. And finally, in terms of interest activities, there was this focus on wanting to participate in public debates that were not focused on disability. And how often have we, in terms of people who are familiar with activism, how often have we spent our time trapped in echo chambers, talking to ourselves, not influencing the broader agendas, the broader social movements who may be very committed to social justice, but lack a considerable understanding of the nuance of disablement and the nuance of variation in human existence. So there was a focus on how to be an activist in non-specific disability spaces as well. So my final provocative statement here is disabled people's social movements, the existing forms of social movements, are not doing anywhere near enough to support newcomers, children, young people to engage in disability activism. And when I interviewed, again, 25 people, and I spoke to 250 individuals through their surveys, only 7% said across Europe that enough is being done to support their participation and inclusion. So for me, the focus is how do we create spaces of opportunity, and how do we ensure that we have a sustained disabled people's social movement across Europe that allow for the valuing of young disabled people's participation. And I'll stop there, thank you.
Thank you, Miro. That was absolutely fascinating and an amazing amount of work to be able to bring those perspectives to bear. So we'll move on now to Ralu, who's going to join us here at the podium, and we'll look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here today with all of you. And I want to thank the organizers for inviting me on this panel. I'm very happy to be the second speaker to speak after Miro, because a lot of the things he mentioned are reflected in what I'm about to talk, but on a more personal experience. So first, let me introduce myself a little bit, so you know who I am and why I'm here, after all. As my colleague introduced me, my name is Ralu. I am a transmasculine person. I use he, they pronouns. I have ADHD, and I suspect I might be on autism spectrum as well, but I don't have an official diagnosis. And my experience as an activist came around 5 years ago, when I joined a local queer Romanian organization as a volunteer. After my ADHD diagnosis, I started to talk more and more about disability and about the struggles that come with it. I worked and collaborated with many organizations, with grassroots organizations, advocacy groups, international organizations, whose work included young, queer, and/or disabled people. So I always had this intersectional approach, because I am an intersectional person after all. Currently I'm co-chair at IGLIO. We do a lot of work with young activists, young queer activists. We have a lot of capacity trainings. I was and still am involved in a certain capacity with those programs. And I have worked in a lot of events, especially in-person events, focusing on the accessibility part. Now, moving on. When I first was invited to speak on this panel, I had a lot of thoughts on this topic. Well, as the least 5 years of my life consisted in being an activist and advocating for the rights of marginalized communities, especially the LGBTQ+ and disabled community, which I am part of. It took me a while to put all of my thoughts together, and I didn't really know why. It is, after all, my experience and knowledge. And then I realized it is because it was so hard to put my struggles into words, because as a young queer activist with an invisible disability, those very struggles and needs have always been labeled as a lack of effort from my part. So I decided that today I will talk about my experience as a young queer disabled activist working in organizations and having traits of an invisible disability that has to deal especially with executive dysfunction. Let us then talk about, quote unquote, the ugly traits of being neurodivergent and struggling with executive dysfunction. You might be wondering what do I mean by that? In case you are unfamiliar with the topic, executive dysfunction occurs when the brain has difficulty with important functions related to memory, attention, thinking, and your general functioning. Executive dysfunction causes functional impairments in a person's daily life. These impairments could include difficulty processing information, a difficulty with task initiation, struggling doing basic tasks like eating, showering, cooking, having poor working memory, difficulty in doing chores, struggling with long texts, planning and organization, and so on. Now, why am I focusing on this? These very same traits have been stigmatized and deemed shameful by our society. Ever since we were children, if we couldn't perform to what was considered the basic standard, we were called lazy. If we made too many mistakes and asked too many questions in order to be able to process information easier, we were called stupid. If at school or at the workplace we took too many breaks, we broke eye contact, we used STEAM tools to regulate ourselves, we were called unprofessional. So in order to exist safely within the societal parameters, we were forced to mask. But masking is like a double-edged sword. It awards you with the acceptance in neurotypical places and spaces, but it takes away a lot of effort and energy from your part. Now, to begin with, as a person who struggles with executive dysfunction, I have very little energy to operate with in a daily basis. And when I need to mask, I very often surpass the limit that is available to me, fact which can become physically painful. Now, moving to talking about organizations, more often than not, non-profit organizations and advocacy and activist spaces borrow the same work ethic and structures from corporations and other capitalistic places of work that focus, of course, on productivity. While it might very well work for certain individuals, for those of us who are struggling with executive dysfunction, it can be very hard to cope with. Thinking that you're part of an organization who advocates for your community, you might think that you can safely unmask and ask for accommodations, right? But unfortunately, this has not always been the case. And if you add on top of this the very difficult and frustrating work of advocating for rights and acceptance, it is very easy to get into burnout. And burnout as a neurodivergent person is very different than the burnout of a neurotypical person. To make movements more accessible for us, we first need to talk about feeling safe in the environment we advocate in. But first, let's talk a little bit more about movements and organizations. I think we all know of at least one organization that advocates for disabled youth without including us or learning from us. In my experience, I was almost always among the first to educate within those spaces about my traits and about my needs and about accessibility, and I had to push hard. Because the traits that I express, those that are related to executive dysfunction, are deemed childish or inappropriate. So I really had to push hard. This has proven to be exhausting. Why does our mere presence in a space need to become an advocacy project just to be able to participate and be fully included? And why was I not taken seriously or understood when I expressed my struggles in regards with my executive dysfunction? And now, during the panels at the summer school, we've talked a lot about self-determination and the right to make decisions for ourselves. And I would like to contribute to that conversation by talking about self-determination in activist spaces. We have met during this week so many disabled activists who managed to break that glass ceiling and have done amazing, amazing work. But there are so many others who might be working with intersectional groups, especially in groups that whose focus isn't specifically disability, and whose struggles and needs go quietly unnoticed, and who are too ashamed or scared to ask for accommodation. I used to be one of them. The impairments due to my executive dysfunction left me feeling infantilized after a lifetime of being criticized. There is so much guilt and shame that builds up over the years, and that wall of awful is so hard to destroy. Especially since, as a person who could adapt and find ways to cope, the results of my work contradicted any visible sign of my invisible disability. So then it was very, very easy for people to not believe me. This is why it's very important to deconstruct the idea of professionalism. What does it really mean, professionalism, when we think about it? So if you think about it, in many spaces, professionalism goes against those very traits that I mentioned earlier in my speech, that are related to productivity, to functioning, quote unquote, properly, to attain this very high standard of productivity and capitalism. There are a lot of factors that contribute to an inaccessible space for neurodivergent disabled people who struggle with executive dysfunction. But the most significant factor is feeling unsafe in the space you work in. Why is safety so important, after all? Just think of what safety really means for you as a disabled person, as a disabled activist. For me, and for many other neurodivergent people, it means to have the space to be heard, to be met with kindness, with patience, with the effort from the other's part to be accommodated. It means to be able to unmask and be myself. And unfortunately, what I've seen in a lot of activist spaces is that there is this quote-unquote cleanliness associated with disability. There is like a like a standard of, okay, you're disabled, but what it is proper to show, and what is already improper, and we should already leave aside. Now, working in many intersectional places in both grassroots organizations and international spaces, advocacy groups, I worked within both queer and non-queer organizations and spaces. And always in those areas, the I was either the first or, if not the first, one of the people who brought the disability idea and dimension to the conversation. And something very interesting that I discovered is that I, as a queer disabled person, I felt safer in queer spaces and queer movements rather than in non-queer movements, even though both these movements discussed about the disability. Now, maybe one of the reasons is that there is a huge overlap between being queer and being neurodivergent. As I discovered without even realizing when I started to talk about disability and about accessibility, especially in trainings and in workshops, I discovered a big audience formed by queer disabled people. So it ended up being more of a community gathering, of having conversations with each other and truly understanding our needs, talking about those traits and needs, because those people, and a lot of those people, didn't have the chance to talk about those things with anyone. And this is one thing I also discovered when I was diagnosed. There were organizations where, even though they put a lot of effort into trying to make a place accessible and inclusive for everyone, I didn't quite feel safe, and it was hard to really pinpoint why. And I think it was exactly because they had a reluctance to take my needs seriously, or to really understand why I need sometimes to STEAM, or sometimes to have a different way of learning. And those very spaces sometimes have difficulty, or had difficulty, in accommodating people with multiple disabilities, especially in events, making these events accessible. So now, the organization that I'm part of, IGLIO, it's one of the best examples of good practices that I had so far. I'm just going to mention a few, from going over budget to accommodate deaf people in an event, from having safe spaces to reach out and be vulnerable about my struggles, and being met with kindness and help, asking and respecting one's needs, just ensuring that during events there are always volunteers at in-person events to check on disabled people, and making sure that their needs are constantly met and that we're properly included. So to me, it feels like that was a professional place. But why can't professionalism mean passion for the cause? And why are we so focused and so stuck up on the format it takes? And it's interesting that when my needs are accommodated and we create an inclusive space for people with executive dysfunction, we realize that a lot of non-disabled neurotypical people benefit from those accommodations as well. So we actually create a place more inclusive for everyone. And the last part that I want to talk about is accessibility. Is based on my experiences, both as an activist and a queer disabled person, what does accessibility mean? Now, one thing that I noticed is that it's hard for non-disabled and neurotypical people in youth activism spaces to be properly accommodated. It's hard from the perspective of the organizers. And I figured out that one of those reasons is because sometimes the organizers, it's like they fear us. They fear to approach us due to the fear of getting things wrong and being offensive. So what happened they just not even attempt to accommodate us. Because if they don't try, how can they make a mistake, right? But here's the problem. If you don't make a mistake, how can you learn? We need to normalize making mistakes. We need to normalize making mistakes and correcting ourselves and just moving on with our life. Now, the most important thing is to have a safe space, as I mentioned before. How can you create that safe space? Well, first of all, treat us, talk to us, approach us like you would a non-disabled person. And that means to take our needs seriously and believe us when we communicate them to you, and create a safe space for us to trust and voice our needs. Keep an open mind when I tell you that I struggle with something that you were taught to believe was infantilized or childish or just a lazy person maybe. Believe that maybe it's a part of a disability, and maybe I need accommodations in order to be productive and functional. And also do more research and try to learn more about the needs and traits of the neurotype you work with and from disabled people. That's very important. Take the word of the disabled person. That's why most of my information actually comes from disabled people on TikTok or on Instagram rather than researches made by non-disabled people. And another very important thing is to normalize the use of STEAM toys, normalize asking many questions, normalize making mistakes and learning from your mistakes. And the last thing that's, I think, one of the most important, ask. Always ask. Don't be afraid to ask. Because I believe most of us here today are very willing to talk about what we need, how you can accommodate us, to share the parts that are relevant for us being properly included in this space. So for me, and I think this, the activism movement, and just to conclude, the activism space is the intersectional activism space. Really needs to make accessibility for disabled people a priority. And keep this in mind when creating events, when creating capacity building programs, when creating research and so on. I could talk a lot more about this, but of course I'm out of time. So I hope you enjoyed my presentation. And I will be here during break, and we can talk more about this if you're interested. Thank you very much.
Rally, thank you so much. That was extremely powerful. To give your personal testimony takes absolutely incredible effort and time and care, adding in all of your expertise to that, and it's a real privilege for us to hear it, and very generous of you to also offer to continue the thoughts right through the rest of the day, and we'll look forward to more at the Q&A. So moving on to Martine, we'll hear from Martine Eliasson online now.
Everyone, my name is Martine. Hello everyone, my name is Martine Eliasson. I'm working as a political advisor in Uloba Independent Living Norway. Uloba is a part of the European Independent Living movement, but we are also the organization that took the idea of personal assistance and put it into practice in Norway. Today, I will talk about Uloba's new activist camp for young adults, which we called Camp Freedom. Camp Freedom is an activist camp for young people between the ages of 18 to 35. The aim is to equip, inspire, and give power to tomorrow's disability rights activists, so we can stand together in the fight for equality and human rights. Our activist camp, Camp Freedom, is inspired by the summer camp from Netflix documentary Crip Camp about Camp Janet, which was organized outside the New York in the 60s and 70s. At Camp Janet, young disabled people could be young people first and foremost. Personal assistance was a natural part of everyday life, and the camp became a haven for young people at the time when disabled people was almost invisible in everyday life. Judith Human was a young woman from Brooklyn, New York, who was one of these participants. And we know her today as the pioneer in the independent living movement. Our fight for equality has always been fronted by young activists. And we organized Camp Freedom for the first time in summer 2021. Due to the pandemic, the camp was conducted digitally on Teams. 16 young participants had signed on the Camp Freedom. Through the very first camp week, the participants became familiar with the disability rights movement, the UN Convention on the Right of Persons with Disabilities, the various models of disability and sexuality, and the participants heard presentation from our own activists and counselors in Uloba and other disability rights activists. In addition, time was included in the program so that the participants can take knowledge into practice by, for example, writing an article, slam poetry, poem, creating a video, or planning another action or something else related to the disability rights. In the evening, participants were given the opportunity to participate in social activities and reflections. This year, we organized Camp Freedom in person from Thursday 10th of August to Sunday 13th of August. The camp will be held at Uloba's members' house in Drammen, and it will be a weekend packed with good educational presentations and conversation, and at least social activities. This year camp, we will look on how you can use your voice in this year's municipal elections. We will use the climate activism as an example of activism working and leading to real political change. And we think this is a very important topic because we know that people with disability may be more vulnerable to climate change than the general population, because decision makers may not fully consider people with disabilities in their planning. One of the reasons is that climate change effect on disabled people has not been studied as much as other populations. Emergency warnings and other important measures may not have been designed as accessibility in mind. This can make it difficult for disabled people to plan for extreme weather events. They may be need of ongoing medical care, which can be disrupted before, during, and after a natural disaster or extreme weather event. Disabled people are more likely to have social and economic risk factors, such as poverty and unemployment, and that will put them into greater risk. So this is why we put climate activism as a topic in this year, Camp Freedom. And of course, we will also talk about personal assistance that is and have been fought by disabled activists themselves. And with personal assistance, you also get the opportunity to choose to be an activist, no matter what cause you are passionate about. And in Norway, there's a lot of youth that don't get enough hours of personal assistance to live independently in the society. And it's a lot of youth that don't get enough personal assistance to take higher education and then be fit to employment. So this is an extremely important topic for us. It's also it's a great variation in Norway where you live on how much hours of assistance you get. If you live in the north of Norway, you can be lucky to have all the hours of assistance that you need to live independently. But for instance, different parts in Oslo, it can be very hard to get enough hours of personal assistance, and even though get personal assistance at all. And then you don't get your right to live independently in the society on the equal basis with others. And during the camp, the young participants get new contacts. Perhaps they form new friendship. They will also have the opportunity to meet young politicians and advocate for their human rights. This is important that we get a new generation of disability rights defenders and activists. Our courts are not something that we have won once and for all. If we disabled people stop fighting the battle for equality, we will return to institution, isolation, experience, and a weak role in the society. We can never rest. An important role for future activists is to be a watchdog. We must not accept fewer opportunities and rights than other person in the society. We must not be satisfied with anything less than other in the society can expect. And therefore, it's extremely important to us in Uloba to get new activists and young people that have the knowledge of the disability rights movements and also the human rights. So it's unfortunately not something we can take for granted. We have to fight for our human rights so that we have a natural part in the society and can live independently on the equal basis with others. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martine. That was a fascinating introduction to such an important event and effort to achieve everything that our other two speakers have spoken so eloquently